The day I got fined $2,500 for having unsightly weeds in my front yard was the day I discovered those weeds were a federally protected habitat worth $50 million in environmental penalties. Rebecca Martinez, HOA president of Sunset Ridge Estates, strutted up my driveway at 6:30 a.m. in her pristine white Range Rover, clipboard in one hand and a smug expression that could cut glass. The morning dew still clung to what she called noxious vegetation, but what she didn't know was that I just turned her entire manicured subdivision into an environmental crime scene that would make the EPA salivate. 3 years of escalating harassment from this woman, 3 years of fines for maintaining what she called an eyesore that supposedly violated community standards, certified letters arriving weekly demanding compliance with landscaping requirements that seemed designed specifically to target my property. Rebecca had no clue that her pristine Kentucky bluegrass lawns were actually destroying a critical habitat for the endangered Carner blue butterfly, and that every fine she'd issued was about to cost her HOA more money than most people see in a lifetime. The irony was beautiful in its simplicity. While Rebecca obsessed over forcing me to replace native prairie plants with water-hungry suburban grass, she'd unknowingly created the perfect legal storm that would protect this ecosystem for generations. By the time I was done, she'd be facing federal investigators, environmental lawyers, and a community that finally understood what she'd been trying to destroy in the name of property values. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment with your location because I want to know if HOA environmental destruction is this rampant everywhere, or if Rebecca Martinez represents a special kind of ecological ignorance that deserves its own documentary. Let me take you back to where this nightmare started, because understanding how I ended up in this suburban battlefield requires knowing why this particular patch of Illinois prairie mattered more than any manicured lawn ever could. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I'm a disabled Army veteran who served 3 tours in Afghanistan before an IED blast in Kandahar province sent me home with a Purple Heart, chronic pain, and a desperate need for somewhere quiet to heal. After 18 months in VA hospitals and another year of physical therapy that felt like torture disguised as rehabilitation, I used my disability settlement to buy a modest ranch house in what seemed like the perfect place to rebuild my life, Sunset Ridge Estates wasn't my first choice, but the house came with something I'd never seen in suburban developments: a 2-acre lot that hadn't been completely stripped of its original ecosystem. The previous owner, an elderly botanist named Dr. Eleanor Chun, had spent 40 years carefully maintaining native Illinois prairie plants, despite constant pressure from neighbors to clean up her property. When I walked through that space for the first time, something about the gentle movement of tall grass in the wind reminded me of peaceful moments between the chaos of deployment, rare quiet times when the world felt manageable again. Dr. Chun's granddaughter explained during the closing that her grandmother had been fighting the HOA for decades to preserve what she called the last remnant of authentic prairie in the county. The old woman had documented every plant species, maintained detailed ecological records, and even hosted university research projects studying soil composition and native plant genetics. What looked like random weeds to suburban eyes was actually a carefully curated ecosystem that supported dozens of indigenous species that had been disappearing from Illinois for over a century. The property records showed that Dr. Chun had legally established her landscaping choices through a conservation easement filed with the county in 1987, long before Sunset Ridge Estates was even conceived. This meant that any attempt to force changes to the native vegetation would require approval from both the county Environmental Board and the State Department of Natural Resources. The HOA covenants actually contain specific language protecting existing landscaping arrangements that predated the subdivision's establishment, legal protection that Dr. Chun had insisted upon when the developers tried to purchase her property for inclusion in their project. Moving to Sunset Ridge felt like coming home to a place I'd never been before. The morning routine of walking through the prairie grass with my coffee, listening to bird songs that had been silenced in most suburban environments, gave me the first genuine peace I'd experienced since my injury. Physical therapy sessions in the VA hospital had been sterile and institutional, but something about the natural movement required to maintain the prairie paths helped my damaged leg in ways that clinical exercise never had. The seasonal changes in the native plants created a living calendar that helped ground me when PTSD made time feel unstable and threatening. But suburban paradise has a way of revealing its true nature once you've signed the mortgage papers and committed to the community. The first indication that trouble was brewing came during the spring homeowners meeting, when Rebecca Martinez approached me with a folder full of helpful suggestions for bringing my property into compliance with community standards. Her smile was perfectly practiced, the kind of aggressive friendliness that real estate professionals use to mask ulterior motives. But her eyes held the cold calculation of someone who sees obstacles to be eliminated rather than neighbors to be welcomed. Rebecca's background made her hostility toward natural landscaping almost inevitable. She'd built Sunset Ridge estates from the ground up, transforming what had been working farmland into a subdivision that looked like it belonged in a home and garden magazine rather than the Illinois prairie. Every house was required to maintain specific grass varieties. Approved plant lists limited residents to non-native species that required constant irrigation and chemical treatments, and architectural guidelines ensured that no structure deviated from her vision of suburban perfection. The success of her development had made her wealthy enough to afford the kind of lifestyle that depends on controlling every detail of the environment around her. The woman lived in the largest house in the subdivision, a colonial monstrosity, with 4-car garage and a circular driveway that required an irrigation system more complex than some municipal water plants. Her husband ran a landscaping company that held exclusive contracts for subdivision maintenance, a convenient arrangement that ensured every lawn met her exacting standards while funneling HOA fees directly into their family business. Rebecca's position as both developer and HOA president created obvious conflicts of interest, but most residents were either too intimidated or too invested in property values to challenge her authority. Her initial approach was subtle, almost apologetic. The subdivision had certain standards to maintain, she explained, and while she appreciated my service to the country, community harmony required everyone to participate in maintaining the aesthetic vision that protected property values for all residents. The native plants were lovely in their own way, but they didn't quite fit the refined atmosphere that Sunset Ridge residents expected when they invested in premium housing. Surely I could understand that allowing one property to deviate from established norms might encourage others to make similar choices, ultimately degrading the carefully maintained environment that made our community special. The conversation lasted 20 minutes, but I could see the steel underneath Rebecca's diplomatic language. This wasn't a request or a suggestion. It was an ultimatum delivered with enough plausible deniability to avoid seeming overtly threatening. She wanted me to replace 40 years of ecological restoration with generic suburban landscaping, destroying an irreplaceable ecosystem to satisfy her aesthetic preferences and business interests. The woman had no understanding of what Dr. Chun had spent her lifetime creating, an appreciation for the complexity and value of natural systems that had evolved over centuries before being nearly eliminated by agricultural and suburban development. What Rebecca didn't realize during that first confrontation was that she'd just declared war on someone who'd spent 3 years learning how to fight much more dangerous enemies than suburban presidents. Military training teaches you to assess threats, identify resources, and develop strategic responses to overwhelming odds. The skills that kept me alive in Afghanistan were about to prove very useful in protecting the small piece of prairie that had become my sanctuary from the chaos that war had left in my mind. The morning dew still sparkled on the native grass outside my kitchen window as I watched Rebecca's Range Rover disappear down the street, her perfectly manicured subdivision spread out like a green carpet that had been rolled over the bones of what this landscape used to be. She had money, political connections, and legal authority, but what she didn't have was an understanding of the ecological treasure she was trying to destroy. That ignorance was about to become the weapon I'd use to turn her own system against her, protecting the prairie and teaching her community what they'd been missing while pursuing the illusion of suburban perfection. The first fine arrived exactly 2 weeks after my conversation with Rebecca, delivered by certified mail on official Sunset Ridge Estates. Letterhead that probably cost more per sheet than most people spend on lunch. $500 for failure to maintain approved landscaping standards, with a detailed citation describing my overgrown weeds as a threat to community aesthetic values and property marketability. The language was so absurdly clinical that I had to read it twice to believe someone had actually typed those words with a straight face. Rebecca's escalation timeline was predictable in its corporate efficiency. Week 1, friendly neighbor chat about community standards. Week 2, official violation notice with financial penalties. The woman operated like a military campaign, methodical and relentless, except her enemy was a patch of prairie grass that had been thriving on this land since before her grandfather was born. What she couldn't have known was that every official document she sent was creating a paper trail that would eventually document her systematic destruction of protected environmental resources. The fine itself was laughable compared to what I'd faced in Afghanistan, but the principle behind it made my pressure spike in ways that reminded me why the VA had prescribed meditation techniques for combat stress. Here was a woman who'd built her wealth by paving over farmland, demanding that I destroy an ecosystem that had survived ice ages, droughts, and a century of agricultural pressure. Also, her artificial paradise could maintain the kind of sterile uniformity that real estate magazines celebrate as the American dream. I called the number listed on the violation notice, reaching Rebecca's assistant, a nervous young woman named Jennifer who clearly handled these confrontations on a regular basis. Her script was well rehearsed. The HOA covenants were legally binding. All residents had agreed to maintain community standards, and failure to comply would result in escalating fines until the violation was corrected. When I mentioned that my landscaping consisted of native Illinois plants that predated the subdivision by centuries, Jennifer's pause told me this wasn't the usual pushback she encountered. "I'll need to transfer you to Mrs. Martinez," she said, her voice dropping to the tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news to someone they actually like. Rebecca's voice carried the kind of aggressive cheerfulness that customer service representatives perfect after years of dealing with complaints they have no intention of resolving. She understood my concerns, she really did, but community standards existed for everyone's benefit. Property values depended on consistent maintenance of approved landscaping, and allowing exceptions would set a dangerous precedent that could affect every homeowner's investment. The native plants were lovely, she was sure, but they simply didn't fit the refined aesthetic that Sunset Ridge residents expected when they chose to live in a premium community. "Mrs. Martinez," I said, keeping my voice level despite the frustration building in my chest, "these aren't random weeds. This is restored Illinois prairie that was here long before your development existed. The previous owner spent 40 years documenting and maintaining native species that are disappearing from the state." Her laugh was the kind of dismissive sound that people make when they've already decided your opinion doesn't matter. "Mr. Thompson, I understand you're new to homeownership and HOA communities. We all have to make adjustments when we join established neighborhoods. The plants might be native, but they look unkempt and they're affecting property values for your neighbors. I'm sure you wouldn't want to be responsible for lowering everyone's home equity. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes. But the outcome was predetermined. Rebecca had no interest in botanical education or ecological preservation. She wanted compliance with her aesthetic vision, and she was prepared to use financial pressure to achieve it. The fine would double every month until I replaced the native plants with approved grass varieties. End of discussion. That evening, I walked through the prairie restoration for the first time since receiving Rebecca's ultimatum, seeing it through different eyes. What had been a peaceful sanctuary now felt like a battlefield, where every plant represented a potential casualty in Rebecca's war against natural landscaping. The tall grass that helped calm my anxiety after nightmares, the wildflowers that attracted birds whose songs replaced the helicopter noise that sometimes echoed in my head. The entire ecosystem that had become my personal therapy space was under assault by someone who saw dollar signs where I saw healing. Dr. Chin's granddaughter had left me a box of her grandmother's research, botanical surveys and plant inventories that I'd been meaning to examine more carefully. That night, I spread the documents across my kitchen table, using my laptop to cross-reference scientific names with current conservation databases. What I discovered made Rebecca's weeds comment even more infuriating, and as it turned out, legally problematic in ways she couldn't have imagined. The prairie restoration contained 14 species listed as threatened or endangered by the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, including wild lupine that served as the primary host plant for Karner blue butterfly larvae. Dr. Chun's meticulous records documented population counts, flowering cycles, and genetic diversity data that university researchers had used for peer-reviewed studies on prairie ecosystem recovery. This wasn't just random native vegetation. It was a scientifically managed habitat that supported species barely surviving anywhere else in the state. More importantly, Dr. Chun had registered the property with the Illinois Natural Areas Inventory in 1995, designating it as a Grade A prairie remnant worthy of protection under state environmental regulations. The registration had been renewed every 5 years, most recently in 2020, creating ongoing legal obligations that superseded any HOA covenants or local landscaping ordinances. Rebecca's demands weren't just aesthetically misguided. They were potentially criminal violations of state environmental protection laws. The federal implications were even more serious. Karner blue butterflies were listed under the Endangered Species Act, making any action that destroyed their habitat a federal crime punishable by fines up to $50,000 per violation and potential criminal prosecution. The wild lupine in my front yard wasn't just a pretty purple flower. It was federally protected infrastructure that Rebecca wanted me to replace with Kentucky bluegrass that provided zero ecological value and required chemical treatments that would contaminate groundwater. I spent the next 3 days researching environmental law, diving into regulations that I'd never imagined would become relevant to suburban homeownership. The complexity was overwhelming at first, but military training had taught me how to process large amounts of technical information under pressure. What emerged from my research was a legal framework that protected prairie ecosystems in ways that HOA covenants couldn't override. Regardless of what Rebecca believed about her authority over community landscaping decisions, the Illinois Environmental Protection Act included specific provisions preventing destruction of registered natural areas, with penalties that made Rebecca's $500 fine look like pocket change. Violating state environmental regulations could result in fines up to $10,000 per day, plus restoration costs that often exceeded the original property value. If Rebecca pushed her case through HOA legal channels, she'd be creating documented evidence of intentional environmental destruction that state prosecutors could use to build criminal cases against both her and the homeowners association. Federal environmental law was even more severe. The Endangered Species Act didn't recognize local authority over habitat protection, meaning that county judges, HOA boards, And even state legislatures couldn't override federal species protection requirements. Any attempt to force removal of Carter blue butterfly habitat would trigger automatic federal investigation, with potential penalties that could bankrupt not just Rebecca personally, but the entire Sunset Ridge Estates Development Corporation. But the most beautiful discovery was the legal mechanism that would allow me to turn Rebecca's own system against her. Environmental protection laws included citizen enforcement provisions that allowed private individuals to file lawsuits against violators when government agencies failed to act. If Rebecca continued pressuring me to destroy protected habitat, I could sue both her and the HOA for environmental violations, potentially recovering attorney fees and damages while establishing permanent legal protection for the prairie restoration. Irony was perfect in its symmetry. Rebecca thought she was using legal pressure to force compliance with her aesthetic preferences, but she was actually creating evidence of systematic environmental destruction that federal prosecutors could use to dismantle her entire development empire. Every fine, every threat, every official HOA document demanding removal of native plants was building a case that would eventually cost her more money than she'd made from building Sunset Ridge Estates in the first place. I printed copies of the relevant environmental statutes, highlighted the penalties for habitat destruction, and filed everything in a folder that would soon become Rebecca's worst nightmare. The woman who'd tried to intimidate a disabled veteran into destroying an irreplaceable ecosystem was about to learn that some battles choose their own champions, and this particular prairie had just found someone with both the legal ammunition and the military determination to fight back. The next morning, I watched Rebecca's Range Rover cruise slowly past my house, probably documenting violations for her next escalation. What she saw was the same overgrown weeds that had been annoying her for months. What I saw was a federally protected habitat worth more in environmental penalties than her entire subdivision, and a legal weapon that would soon teach her the difference between real authority and the illusion of control that comes with a clipboard and a bad attitude. The foundation of this battle stretched back to my grandfather, Staff Sergeant William Thompson, who bought 40 acres of original Illinois prairie in 1952 with his GI Bill benefits and a dream of farming land that hadn't been touched by industrial agriculture. What he discovered was something more valuable than crops, a piece of America that looked exactly the same as when Native American tribes had managed it for thousands of years before European settlement changed everything. Grandpa was smart enough to recognize that this wasn't just land. It was living history that deserved protection more than it needed plowing. My childhood summers were spent learning to identify native plants alongside Grandpa, who treated the prairie like a library where every species told stories about climate, soil, and the intricate relationships that kept ecosystems stable across centuries. He taught me that big bluestem grass could grow roots 15 feet deep, creating soil stability that prevented erosion during the kind of storms that washed away shallow-rooted crops. Wild bergamot attracted native pollinators that had co-evolved with prairie plants, creating partnerships that industrial agriculture couldn't replicate with imported honeybees and chemical fertilizers. This grass was here when Lincoln was splitting rails, Grandpa would say, running his weathered hands through stems that towered over my 8-year-old head. Your great-great-grandfather would have seen the same plants when he homesteaded in Iowa. Most folks think progress means replacing what nature spent millennia perfecting, but some things are too valuable to improve. The property had been in our family for 3 generations, passed down through careful estate planning that preserved both the land and Grandpa's conservation philosophy. When suburban development began creeping across central Illinois in the 1980s, turning farmland into subdivisions that looked identical from Ohio to Colorado, Grandpa made a decision that would protect the prairie long after his death. He donated a conservation easement to the state, legally preventing any future owner from destroying native vegetation or developing the land for Commercial purposes. My parents inherited the property when Grandpa died in 1998, but their lives in Chicago left little time for rural land management. They maintained the conservation easement and paid property taxes, but the daily care that prairie restoration requires was beyond their urban lifestyle. When Dr. Chun approached them about purchasing the land for her botanical research, they saw an opportunity to ensure the prairie would receive the expert attention that Grandpa's legacy deserved. Dr. Chun's purchase agreement included specific provisions protecting the conservation easement and expanding the restoration project using scientific methods that Grandpa would have admired. She spent the next 20 years documenting plant genetics, soil composition, and wildlife populations, creating research data that universities across the Midwest used to understand how prairie ecosystems functioned before agricultural development fragmented them into isolated remnants. Her work proved that small patches of original prairie contained genetic diversity that could be used to restore degraded farmland, potentially reversing some of the ecological damage that industrial agriculture had caused across the region. Restoration project became more sophisticated under Dr. Chin's management, incorporating controlled burns that mimicked natural fire cycles, seed collection programs that preserved genetic variations within native plant populations, and wildlife monitoring that tracked everything from soil bacteria to migratory bird populations. What had been a well-preserved remnant became a living laboratory that demonstrated how prairie ecosystems could be restored even in areas that had been developed for agriculture or suburban housing. Dr. Chun's health began failing in 2019. She faced the same challenge that Grandpa had confronted decades earlier, ensuring that the prairie would survive her death without being destroyed by heirs who might not understand its scientific and ecological value. Her solution was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than selling to developers who would destroy the restoration for maximum profit, she would find a buyer who understood that some things were more important than money, someone who needed the peace that only undisturbed nature could provide. My transition from active duty military to civilian life had been rougher than I'd expected, filled with medical appointments, paperwork battles with the VA, and the kind of psychological adjustment that doesn't respond to standard therapy approaches. The blast that ended my military career had damaged more than my leg. It had left me with hypervigilance, sleep disorders, and anxiety that made crowded places feel like potential battlefields. Traditional suburban housing felt claustrophobic and artificial, surrounded by neighbors whose biggest problems involved lawn care and property taxes rather than life and death decisions that combat veterans. Carry long after coming home. Dr. Chun's granddaughter understood what I needed before I did. During our first meeting, she explained that her grandmother had specifically wanted to find a veteran buyer, someone who would appreciate the peace that the prairie provided while having the determination to protect it from future development. Pressure. The property offered something that VA hospitals and therapy sessions couldn't. A place where the hypervigilance that made civilian life exhausting became a useful skill for observing wildlife and monitoring ecosystem health. The legal structure that Dr. Chun had created was brilliant in its comprehensive protection. The conservation easement prevented any destruction of native vegetation, while the Illinois Natural Areas Inventory Registration provided state-level protection that superseded local zoning ordinances and HOA covenants. Federal Endangered Species Act protections for the Karner blue butterfly habitat created another layer of legal protection that even state governments couldn't override. What looked like a simple land purchase was actually a multi-layered legal fortress designed to protect the prairie from exactly the kind of development pressure that Rebecca represented. The property came with 40 years of scientific documentation, research partnerships with 3 universities, and legal protections that made it essentially impossible to develop or significantly alter without triggering multiple state and federal violations. Dr. Chen had spent decades building a case for prairie conservation that could withstand challenges from developers, local governments, and homeowners associations that valued aesthetic conformity over ecological preservation. Moving to the prairie felt like coming home to a place I'd never been, where morning walks through tall grass provided the kind of physical therapy that helped my damaged leg while offering mental peace that psychiatric medications couldn't replicate. The seasonal rhythms of native plants created structure for days that had felt chaotic since leaving military service, where every hour had been scheduled and purposeful. Watching monarch butterflies navigate by instincts that guided them across thousands of miles reminded me that some forms of navigation didn't require maps or GPS technology. The irony of buying property in Sunset Ridge Estates was that Dr. Chun's land had never actually been part of the subdivision. Rebecca's development had been built around the prairie restoration, incorporating it into marketing materials that advertised natural surroundings and preserved open space without mentioning that the preservation was legally protected and couldn't be altered to match suburban landscaping preferences. Homebuyers had been sold the aesthetic benefits of prairie views without understanding that those views came with federal protection that prevented any changes to maintain them. Rebecca's development had been designed to capitalize on the prairie's visual appeal while maintaining the kind of controlled landscaping that maximized property values and minimized maintenance complexity. Residents got to enjoy views of authentic Illinois ecosystem from their backyard decks while maintaining Kentucky bluegrass lawns that required irrigation, fertilization, and chemical treatments that would have horrified Dr. Chun. The marketing was genius. Sell people the appearance of natural living while ensuring they never had to deal with the unpredictability that real ecosystems required. But Rebecca's business model contained a fatal flaw that she'd never recognized. The prairie restoration that provided visual appeal for her subdivision was protected by environmental laws that superseded any HOA authority, creating a situation where her most valuable marketing asset was also completely beyond her control. She could regulate grass height in suburban lawns, but she couldn't touch the native plants that gave Sunset Ridge Estates its distinctive character and market appeal. The property transfer had been completed 6 months before I moved in, but the legal protections had been accumulating for decades. Between Grandpa's original conservation easement, Dr. Chun's scientific registration with state environmental agencies, and federal protections for endangered species habitat, the prairie had more legal armor than most government installations. Rebecca's assumption that HOA covenants could override environmental law was about to become an expensive education in the hierarchy of legal authority. My first month in the house had been peaceful, filled with morning coffee walks through grass that had been growing in the same location since before Columbus reached America. The restoration project gave structure to retirement from military service, providing daily tasks that felt meaningful without the life or death pressure that had defined my previous career. Rebecca's confrontation had shattered that peace, but it had also awakened skills that 3 tours in Afghanistan had honed to perfection: the ability to assess threats, gather intelligence, and develop strategic responses to enemies who underestimated both my resources and my determination to protect what mattered most. Enter Rebecca Martinez, the kind of woman who wore designer workout clothes to check her mailbox and drove a Range Rover that cost more than most people's annual salary just to pick up dry cleaning 3 blocks from her house. Picture this: 54 years old with platinum blonde hair styled into what could only be described as a suburban combat helmet, manicured nails that had never touched actual dirt, and the kind of artificial smile that real estate professionals practice in mirrors until it looks almost genuine. Her morning uniform consisted of athleisure wear that probably cost more than my monthly disability payment, accessorized with oversized sunglasses that she wore even on cloudy days to maintain the illusion of celebrity status in a subdivision that barely qualified as a small town. Rebecca's daily routine involved patrolling Sunset Ridge estates in her pristine white Range Rover like a general inspecting troops, clipboard mounted on her passenger seat filled with violation notices pre-printed, and ready for deployment against any resident who dared deviate from her vision of suburban perfection. The woman had turned homeowners association governance into a personal fiefdom where she controlled everything from mailbox colors to the height of grass blades, treating grown adults like children who needed constant supervision to maintain property values that justified her expensive lifestyle. Her background was classic nouveau rich American success story, built on the foundation of transforming rural Illinois farmland into cookie-cutter subdivisions that looked like they'd been designed by committee and manufactured in a factory. Rebecca had started as a small-time real estate agent in the 1990s, selling modest homes to young families who couldn't afford anything better. But her real genius was recognizing that suburban buyers would pay premium prices for the illusion of country living without any of the inconveniences that actual rural life required. Sunset Ridge estates represented the culmination of Rebecca's development philosophy: maximum profit margins, disguised as premium lifestyle marketing. She'd purchased 800 acres of working farmland for agricultural prices, then spent 5 years navigating zoning regulations and environmental reviews to transform cornfields into a subdivision that sold homes for 3 times what comparable properties cost in town. The marketing campaign emphasized natural beauty and rural tranquility, conveniently ignoring the fact that she'd destroyed most of the actual natural features to build houses that required constant irrigation to maintain lawns in a climate that received barely enough rainfall to support corn. Rebecca's business model depended on control, the kind of micromanagement that turned homeownership into a perpetual performance evaluation, where any deviation from approved standards triggered financial penalties and legal threats. The HOA covenants she'd written were masterpieces of legal manipulation, giving her authority to regulate everything from exterior paint colors to the species of flowers residents could plant in their own gardens. Violation fines started at $500 and doubled monthly until compliance was achieved, creating revenue streams that funded both her lifestyle and the legal apparatus she used to maintain absolute authority over the community she'd created. The woman's personal residence was a monument to the aesthetic philosophy she imposed on everyone else: a neo-colonial mansion with 4-car garage, circular driveway, and enough square footage to house 3 families comfortably. Her landscape design looked like a golf course that had been attacked by a team of obsessive-compulsive gardeners, featuring geometric patterns of non-native plants that required irrigation systems more complex than municipal water treatment facilities. Every blade of grass was exactly the same height. Every shrub was trimmed into artificial shapes that would have looked at home in Versailles. And the overall effect was sterile perfection that eliminated any trace of the prairie ecosystem that had existed on the land for thousands of years. Rebecca's husband, David Martinez, ran the landscaping company that held exclusive maintenance contracts for Sunset Ridge estates, a convenient arrangement that ensured every lawn met Rebecca's exacting standards while funneling HOA fees directly into their family business. The company specialized in the kind of high-maintenance landscaping that required weekly visits, monthly chemical treatments, and constant irrigation to maintain the artificial green perfection that suburban buyers associated with successful homeownership. David's crew consisted mainly of undocumented workers who were paid below minimum wage to maintain landscapes that cost homeowners more per square foot than luxury hotel rooms. The conflict of interest was obvious to anyone who bothered to examine the financial arrangements, but most Sunset Ridge residents were either too intimidated by Rebecca's legal threats or too invested in property values to challenge the system that kept their home equity inflated. The few residents who had questioned the Martinez family's dual role as both HOA leadership and primary service providers had quickly discovered that Rebecca's interpretation of community covenants included broad authority to fine anyone who disrupted community harmony through frivolous complaints. About HOA governance, Rebecca's motivation for targeting my property was crystal clear once you understood her expansion plans and the financial pressure that her lifestyle required. Phase 2 of Sunset Ridge Estates was already in the planning stages, a 200-home addition that would triple the size of the development and require access to the prairie restoration that formed the eastern boundary of her existing subdivision. With my property, she could create the kind of luxury housing development that would attract buyers willing to pay million-dollar prices for homes that offered authentic prairie views along with suburban convenience. The environmental marketing potential was enormous. Sunset Ridge Prairie Estates, where luxury living meets natural beauty. Rebecca had already commissioned architectural drawings that showed mansion-sized homes positioned to maximize prairie vistas, with private walking trails that would give residents exclusive access to native plant viewing areas. The irony was perfect. She wanted to destroy the prairie ecosystem to build homes that would be marketed based on their proximity to prairie ecosystem, then charge premium prices for the privilege of living next to land that her development would have eliminated. But Rebecca's financial situation was more precarious than her confident demeanor suggested. The original Sunset Ridge development had been financed through a complex arrangement of bank loans, investor partnerships, and municipal bonds that required steady cash flow to service debt payments. Property values needed to continue appreciating to justify the leverage she'd used to fund construction, and any suggestion that the development was environmentally problematic could trigger investor panic that would collapse the entire financial structure she'd built. More immediately, Rebecca owed $2.8 million on construction loans that had been secured using Phase 2 development rights as collateral. The banks had approved financing based on her projections for expanded development, but those projections assumed she could acquire access to the prairie land that would make Phase 2 financially viable. Without my property, her expansion plans would be limited to smaller lots that couldn't command the premium prices necessary to service her existing debt obligations. The woman's behavior during our first confrontation revealed the desperation underneath her authoritative facade. Her insistence that community standards required immediate compliance wasn't really about lawn care. It was about financial survival for someone who'd leveraged everything on continued development success. Rebecca needed my land not just for aesthetic reasons, but because her entire business empire was built on assumptions about continued expansion that my property could either enable or destroy. Her daily harassment routine was calculated to create the kind of stress that would eventually force me to sell or comply with landscaping demands that would eliminate the conservation protections that made my property valuable to environmental organizations and problematic for her development plans. Every violation notice, every fine, every threat of legal action was designed to convince me that fighting her was more expensive and emotionally draining than simply giving her what she wanted. What Rebecca couldn't have known was that her pressure campaign was actually strengthening my resolve while creating documented evidence of systematic harassment that environmental lawyers could use to build federal cases against both her and the homeowners association. Every official letter demanding destruction of protected habitat was potential evidence in criminal prosecutions that could result in personal liability for environmental crimes that carried penalties far more severe than anything I'd faced in Afghanistan. The woman who thought she was intimidating a disabled veteran into submission was actually creating the legal foundation for her own destruction, one violation notice at a time. Rebecca Martinez had built her empire by controlling people through financial pressure and legal intimidation, but she'd never encountered someone who understood that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost, especially when environmental law provided weapons that could turn her own system against her with devastating effectiveness. Rebecca's second violation Notice arrived 10 days after our initial confrontation, this time with photographs attached. That made her complete misunderstanding of prairie ecology painfully obvious. The images showed close-ups of wild bergamot labeled as invasive weeds, purple coneflowers described as unsightly overgrowth, and native grasses identified as fire hazards that threaten community safety. Each photo was annotated with red arrows pointing at plants that environmental scientists would have celebrated. But Rebecca saw only obstacles to the manicured uniformity that her aesthetic vision demanded. The fine had doubled to $1,000 with a stern warning that continued non-compliance would result in escalated enforcement actions, including possible legal proceedings and forced remediation at owner expense. The language was clearly designed to intimidate, but what struck me most was the complete disconnect between Rebecca's perception of environmental threats and the actual ecological value of what she was demanding I destroy. This wasn't just ignorance. It was willful blindness to scientific reality that bordered on environmental vandalism. Her escalation strategy followed a predictable corporate playbook designed to overwhelm property owners with bureaucratic pressure until compliance seemed easier than continued resistance. Within 2 weeks, I'd received complaints filed with the county health department alleging that my unmaintained vegetation was creating breeding grounds for disease-carrying insects. The accusation was so scientifically illiterate that it would have been hilarious if it hadn't triggered an official inspection that required me to take time off from physical therapy appointments to meet with county officials. Inspector Janet Rodriguez arrived on a Thursday morning with the weary expression of someone who'd investigated too many frivolous complaints filed by suburban residents with too much time and too little understanding of basic biology. Her clipboard contained Rebecca's detailed allegations about mosquito breeding areas and tick habitat, claims that demonstrated fundamental ignorance about the difference between standing water and prairie root systems that actually improved drainage by creating deep soil penetration that conventional lawns couldn't match. "Sir, I have to ask," Janet said after spending 20 minutes examining the native plants that Rebecca had identified as public health hazards. "Do you have any standing water on your property? Because everything I'm seeing here would actually reduce mosquito problems, not create them." Her inspection revealed what any competent biologist could have predicted. Native prairie plants created habitat for dragonflies and other insects that controlled mosquito populations naturally, while suburban lawns with their shallow root systems and irrigation requirements created the kind of water accumulation that actually supported disease vector breeding. The health department complaint was dismissed within an hour, but Rebecca's harassment campaign was just getting started. The next salvo came through the fire marshal's office, where she'd filed allegations that my overgrown vegetation created wildfire risks that threatened neighboring properties. The irony was staggering. Rebecca wanted me to replace fire-adapted native plants that had evolved to survive prairie burns with water-hungry suburban landscaping that would create actual fire hazards during drought conditions. Fire Marshal Tom Bradley's inspection was more thorough than the health department visit, involving measurements of vegetation density, assessments of fire break adequacy, and consultations with state forestry experts who specialized in wildfire risk evaluation. What he discovered was that Dr. Chun's careful management had created one of the safest landscapes in the county from a fire perspective, with controlled burn areas that eliminated dead material accumulation and native plants whose deep root systems maintained soil moisture that prevented the kind of surface fires that could spread to structures. Mrs. Martinez seems to think that shorter grass means safer conditions, Tom explained while reviewing his findings. But what you've got here is actually a textbook example of fire-safe landscaping. Those deep-rooted native plants hold moisture in the soil and create natural fire breaks that would stop any surface fire from reaching structures. The suburban lawns she's promoting would dry out faster and burn hotter than anything you're growing. But Rebecca's most aggressive escalation came through the county building and zoning department, where she'd filed complaints alleging that I was operating an illegal agricultural enterprise without proper permits. The accusation was creative in its dishonesty. She claimed that maintaining native plants constituted commercial farming that violated residential zoning restrictions, an interpretation of agricultural law that would have made university botany. Departments into illegal farming operations. Zoning inspector Michael Chang arrived with a stack of regulations and the patience to explain why. Rebecca's complaint demonstrated profound misunderstanding of both agricultural definitions and residential property rights. "Ma'am filed a 30-page complaint," he said, flipping through Rebecca's documentation with barely concealed irritation, "claiming you're running some kind of seed production operation. But everything I'm seeing here is just residential landscaping with native plants. Unless you're selling crops or operating commercial equipment, there's no agricultural violation." The pattern was becoming clear. Rebecca was systematically filing false complaints with every government agency that had any conceivable jurisdiction over residential property use, hoping that sheer bureaucratic volume would eventually overwhelm my ability to respond or force me to comply with her demands rather than continue fighting multiple regulatory battles simultaneously. Each complaint required official responses, documentation, and time that she apparently believed would eventually exhaust my patience with the entire process. Her campaign expanded to include anonymous tips to the state environmental agency alleging that my property was contaminating groundwater through unregulated plant waste and improper soil management. The complaint was so scientifically backwards that it actually triggered an investigation into Rebecca's own irrigation practices, since the investigators recognized that suburban lawn maintenance posed far greater contamination risks than native plant preservation. Environmental scientist Dr. Sarah Kim conducted soil and water tests that revealed what anyone familiar with prairie ecology could have predicted. My property had the cleanest groundwater in the subdivision and soil health that exceeded Agricultural Extension Service recommendations for optimal growing conditions. Whoever filed this complaint doesn't understand basic soil science, Dr. Kim explained while reviewing her test results. Native prairie plants actually improve water quality by filtering runoff and preventing erosion. The real contamination risks come from lawn fertilizers and pesticides that suburban developments use to maintain non-native grass species. The irony deepened when Dr. Kim's investigation revealed that several properties in Sunset Ridge estates were actually violating state water quality regulations through excessive use of lawn chemicals that were creating algae blooms in the county drainage system. Rebecca's attempt to frame native plant preservation as environmental contamination had accidentally exposed her own development as a source of actual pollution that threatened regional water quality. But Rebecca's harassment wasn't limited to official complaints. Her personal intimidation campaign escalated to include drive-by photography sessions, where she'd park her Range Rover on the public road and document every detail of my property with professional equipment that looked more appropriate for surveillance operations than neighborhood HOA enforcement. The woman would spend hours at a time photographing native plants from multiple angles, creating evidence files that she apparently believed would support her various regulatory complaints. Her documentation obsession extended to measuring grass heights with a ruler, testing soil pH levels without any scientific training, and collecting plant samples that she'd submit to county agencies as evidence of various alleged violations. The sight of Rebecca crouched in designer clothing, attempting to conduct amateur botanical research, would have been comical if it hadn't represented systematic harassment of someone whose only crime was maintaining an ecosystem that her suburban aesthetic couldn't tolerate. The community pressure intensified as Rebecca began recruiting neighbors to support her campaign against what she described as environmental neglect that threatens everyone's property values. Her door-to-door canvassing emphasized fears about insects, fire hazards, and declining home equity, playing on suburban anxieties about anything that deviated from conventional landscaping norms that real estate markets rewarded with higher prices. Several neighbors admitted privately that they actually enjoyed the prairie views from their backyard decks, but none were willing to publicly oppose Rebecca's campaign, given her reputation for vindictive enforcement of HOA regulations against anyone who challenged her authority. The climate of fear she'd created was more effective than legal threats at maintaining community support for policies that most residents privately recognized as environmentally destructive and scientifically illiterate. Rebecca's escalation strategy was designed to create unsustainable stress through constant bureaucratic harassment. But what she didn't realize was that every false complaint was creating documented evidence of malicious prosecution that environmental lawyers could use to build both civil and criminal cases against her. The woman who thought she was overwhelming me with regulatory pressure was actually building the legal foundation for her own prosecution under federal environmental protection laws that carried penalties far more severe than anything her HOA could impose. The discovery that would change everything came on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning while I was researching Rebecca's latest complaint to the state agriculture department. She'd escalated to claiming that my uncontrolled plant growth was violating invasive species regulations, an accusation so backwards that it prompted me to dig deeper into the actual legal protection surrounding native Illinois ecosystems. What I found buried in state environmental databases made my coffee cup freeze halfway to my lips and turned Rebecca's harassment campaign into the legal equivalent of a suicide mission. The Illinois Natural Areas Inventory database contained a detailed entry for my property that Dr. Chen had updated just 18 months before her death, but the scope of protection was far more comprehensive than I'd initially understood. The registration didn't just cover my 2 acres, it included a 500-acre buffer zone that encompassed virtually the entire Sunset Ridge Estates development, creating federal and state environmental protections that made Rebecca's landscaping requirements not just inappropriate, but criminally illegal under multiple environmental statutes. Dr. Chen's final update to the natural areas registration had been triggered by her discovery of a Karner blue butterfly population that biologists had assumed was extinct in central Illinois. Her documentation included genetic analysis, proving that the local population was genetically distinct from other surviving colonies, making it irreplaceable from a conservation perspective and automatically triggering the most severe level of Federal Endangered Species Act protection. Every plant in the prairie restoration wasn't just native landscaping, it was federally protected critical habitat that carried criminal penalties of up to $50,000 per violation for any action that caused harm to butterfly breeding areas. The federal implications were staggering. Under the Endangered Species Act, not only was destruction of the habitat prohibited, but any action that harassed, harmed, pursued, hunted, shot, wounded, killed, trapped, captured, or collected protected species was a federal crime. Rebecca's demands that I replace wild lupin, the only plant that Karner blue butterfly larvae could survive on, with suburban grass, constituted conspiracy to commit federal environmental crimes that could result in both massive fines and criminal prosecution. But the legal framework protecting the prairie was even more complex than endangered species law. The Clean Water Act included provisions protecting wetland areas and water quality that extended to prairie ecosystems because of their role in groundwater filtration and flood control. The native plants that Rebecca wanted me to eliminate were actually critical infrastructure for regional water management, preventing erosion and filtering agricultural runoff that would otherwise contaminate municipal water supplies downstream. My research revealed that Dr. Chen had been working with federal wildlife biologists for over a decade to document the prairie's role in supporting not just endangered butterflies, but dozens of other species that depended on native plant communities for survival. Migratory bird species listed under federal protection treaties use the prairie as stopover habitat during spring and fall migrations, making any destruction of native plants a potential violation of international wildlife agreements that superseded all state and local authority. The discovery that sent chills down my spine was finding Dr. Chun's correspondence with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about designating the entire area as critical habitat under the Endangered Species Act. Her scientific documentation was so comprehensive that federal biologists had been preparing formal designation paperwork when her death interrupted the process. The legal protections were already in place through existing statutes, but formal critical habitat designation would have made any development in the area virtually impossible and carried automatic criminal penalties for anyone who knowingly damaged the ecosystem. I called the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Endangered Species Office in Springfield, reaching Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the federal biologist who'd been working with Dr. Chun on habitat protection. Her response to my questions about Rebecca's harassment campaign was immediate and alarming. Any attempt to force removal of wild lupine or other native plants in a known Karner blue butterfly habitat was a federal crime that her office was obligated to investigate and prosecute to the full extent of environmental law. "Mr. Thompson," Dr. Walsh said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades enforcing federal environmental regulations, "what you're describing constitutes environmental coercion under federal statute. If someone is threatening you with fines or legal action to force destruction of protected habitat, that's conspiracy to commit environmental crimes. We take these cases very seriously, especially when they involve endangered species habitat that can't be replaced once it's destroyed." Dr. Walsh explained that the Fish and Wildlife Service had been monitoring the Sunset Ridge area since Dr. Chun's initial butterfly discovery, conducting annual surveys to track population health and habitat quality. Their records showed that the prairie restoration supported the largest known population of Karner blue butterflies in Illinois, making it critical to species survival at the state level. Any reduction in habitat quality could trigger population collapse that would effectively eliminate the species from central Illinois forever. The federal enforcement mechanisms were more powerful than I'd imagined. Under the Endangered Species Act, federal agents had authority to conduct criminal investigations, seize property used in environmental crimes, and pursue prosecution through federal courts that imposed mandatory minimum sentences for habitat destruction. Rebecca's documented demands that I destroy protected species habitat constituted criminal conspiracy that could result in federal charges against both her personally and the Sunset Ridge Homeowners Association as an organization. More importantly, the citizen enforcement provisions of federal environmental law allowed private individuals to file lawsuits against violators when government agencies failed to act quickly enough to prevent environmental damage. If Rebecca continued her harassment campaign, I could sue both her and the HOA in federal court, potentially recovering attorney fees and damages while establishing permanent legal protection that would prevent any future development pressure. State-level protections were equally comprehensive. Illinois environmental regulations included specific criminal penalties for anyone who knowingly destroyed registered natural areas, with fines starting at $10,000 per day and increasing based on the ecological value of damaged habitat. The prairie's status as a grade natural area, the highest level of protection under state law, meant that violations carried maximum penalties that could quickly exceed the value of Rebecca's entire development. But the most devastating discovery was finding the legal mechanism that would allow me to turn Rebecca's own system against her with crushing effectiveness. Environmental protection laws included provisions for recovering damages not just for actual habitat destruction, but for the costs of defending against illegal attempts to force environmental crimes. Every hour I'd spent responding to Rebecca's false complaints Every government inspection she'd triggered through fraudulent allegations, every legal threat she'd made regarding protected habitat destruction was potentially recoverable as damages. In federal environmental court that the Illinois Attorney General's office maintained, a special environmental crimes unit that prosecuted cases involving destruction of protected natural areas. When I contacted them about Rebecca's harassment campaign, the response was immediate. Attempting to coerce destruction of endangered species habitat was a felony under state environmental law, with penalties that included both criminal prosecution and civil liability for restoration costs that often exceeded original property values. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Assistant Attorney General Maria Santos explained that environmental coercion cases were treated as seriously as other forms of extortion because the damage to irreplaceable ecosystems created permanent losses that no amount of money could truly compensate. What you're describing fits the legal definition of environmental extortion, she said during our phone consultation. Using financial pressure or legal threats to force destruction of protected habitat is criminal behavior that we prosecute aggressively. The legal research revealed that Rebecca's harassment campaign had crossed multiple lines that transformed her HOA authority into criminal conspiracy. Federal law didn't recognize local authority over endangered species protection, meaning that HOA covenants, county regulations, and even state laws couldn't override federal species protection requirements. Rebecca's continued pressure to destroy Carter blue butterfly habitat was federal crime in progress, documented through her own violation notices and complaint filings. I printed copies of the relevant federal statutes, state environmental regulations, and legal precedents that establish the comprehensive protection surrounding prairie ecosystems. The folder that contained Rebecca's harassment documents was now evidence in potential federal environmental crimes prosecution, with penalties that could destroy not just her personal wealth, but the entire financial structure of Sunset Ridge Estates development. The irony was perfect in its mathematical precision. Rebecca thought she was using legal pressure to force compliance with aesthetic preferences, but she was actually creating documented evidence of systematic environmental crimes that carried penalties exceeding the total value of her subdivision. Every violation notice demanding destruction of protected habitat was potential evidence in criminal prosecution that could result in federal charges, asset forfeiture, and prison sentences that would make her HOA authority seem laughably irrelevant. Woman who'd tried to intimidate a disabled veteran into destroying irreplaceable ecosystem was about to discover that environmental law provided weapons that could dismantle her entire empire with surgical precision. One violation notice at a time to assemble my team because this wasn't a one-man operation anymore. Rebecca's pattern of environmental harassment had hurt too many people, and the legal framework I discovered was powerful enough to not just protect my property, but establish precedents that would prevent future development abuse across the entire region. The complexity of federal environmental law required specialists who understood both the scientific and legal aspects of habitat protection, while the community organizing needed people who'd been personally affected by Rebecca's systematic intimidation. My first call went to attorney Marcus Rodriguez, a former Army JAG officer who'd transitioned to environmental law after serving 2 tours in Iraq, where he'd witnessed firsthand how resource conflicts destroyed communities. Marcus specialized in Endangered Species Act litigation and had built a reputation for taking on developers who thought federal environmental law was just another regulatory hurdle that money and political connections could overcome. His practice focused on cases where environmental destruction was being carried out through systematic harassment of landowners who couldn't afford prolonged legal battles. Marcus, I need someone who understands both military strategy and federal environmental prosecution, I said during our initial consultation at his office in Springfield. I've got documented evidence of environmental coercion involving endangered species habitat, but this case is bigger than just my property. This woman has been systematically targeting anyone who doesn't conform to her aesthetic vision, and she's about to learn that environmental law doesn't recognize HOA authority. Marcus reviewed my folder of documentation with the kind of systematic thoroughness that military training instilled, cross-referencing Rebecca's violation notices with federal statutes and state environmental regulations. His assessment was immediate and devastating. Rebecca had created a paper trail that constituted criminal conspiracy to destroy federally protected habitat, with penalties that could result in both personal bankruptcy and federal prison time. What you've documented here goes beyond simple HOA overreach, Marcus explained, spreading Rebecca's violation notices across his conference table like evidence in a war crimes tribunal. She's demanding that you commit federal environmental crimes, then threatening financial penalties if you refuse. That's environmental extortion under federal statute, and it carries mandatory minimum sentences that don't include plea bargaining options. The legal strategy Marcus outlined was comprehensive and devastating. We would file simultaneous complaints with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Illinois Attorney General's Environmental Crimes Unit, and the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, creating multiple parallel investigations that would overwhelm Rebecca's ability to respond while ensuring that no single agency delay could prevent prosecution. The citizen enforcement provisions of environmental law would allow us to pursue civil litigation while criminal investigations proceeded, potentially recovering damages that included attorney fees and restoration costs. My second team member was Dr. Patricia Kim, a conservation biologist from the University of Illinois, who'd been collaborating with Dr. Chen on prairie restoration research before her death. Patricia's expertise in endangered species ecology would provide the scientific foundation for proving that Rebecca's demands constituted habitat destruction that could trigger species extinction at the state level. Her academic credentials and PUBLISHED research would establish credibility that HOA landscaping preferences couldn't challenge. Dr. Chun's work was groundbreaking, Patricia explained during our meeting at the university's Natural Resources Building, surrounded by botanical specimens and research equipment that made Rebecca's aesthetic complaints seem absurdly trivial. The Carner blue butterfly population on your property represents genetic diversity that took millennia to develop and could never be recovered once destroyed. What Mrs. Martinez is demanding isn't landscaping, it's ecological genocide. Patricia's scientific documentation was more comprehensive than I'd expected. Her research files contained population surveys, genetic analysis, and habitat quality assessments that proved the prairie restoration supported not just endangered butterflies, but dozens of other species that depended on native plant communities for survival. The ecosystem's value from a biodiversity perspective exceeded the total economic value of Rebecca's entire subdivision, making her development a net loss to society even without considering environmental crimes. The community organizing aspect required reaching out to other property owners who'd been targeted by Rebecca's harassment campaigns, building a coalition that could demonstrate systematic abuse rather than isolated incidents. My first contact was James Wilson, a retired teacher who lived 3 streets over and had been fighting Rebecca's demands that he remove oak trees that supposedly violated sightline regulations for traffic safety. She's been after those trees for 2 years, James explained during our meeting at the local coffee shop, his voice carrying the frustration of someone who'd spent his retirement savings on legal fees to protect 150-year-old oaks that predated the subdivision by decades. Claims they're blocking emergency vehicle access, but the fire department has never complained. It's about sightlines for her Phase 2 development. She needs clear views across my property to market the lots she's planning. James had documentation showing that Rebecca's traffic safety claims were fraudulent, supported by engineering reports that proved the oak trees actually improved drainage and prevented erosion that would have made emergency vehicle access more difficult during severe weather. His case demonstrated the same pattern of using false safety claims to force removal of natural features that interfered with Rebecca's aesthetic vision and development plans. Our third ally was Maria Santos, a single mother who'd been threatened with daily fines for maintaining a vegetable garden that supposedly violated landscaping covenants requiring decorative plantings only. Rebecca's interpretation of HOA rules prohibited any food production, claiming that vegetable gardens created pest problems and reduced property values through agricultural activities that belonged in rural areas rather than premium residential developments. "I'm growing tomatoes and peppers to feed my kids," Maria said, her voice combining anger with bewilderment at Rebecca's priorities. "She wants me to replace food plants with decorative flowers that serve no purpose except looking pretty for potential buyers who might drive through the neighborhood." Meanwhile, her own landscape company charges $200 per month for maintaining flower beds that die every winter and need constant replacement. Maria's situation revealed another aspect of Rebecca's systematic abuse, targeting families who couldn't afford both HOA fines and legal representation, using financial pressure to force compliance with rules that served no legitimate community purpose. Her vegetable garden actually improved property values by demonstrating sustainable living practices that environmentally conscious buyers increasingly valued. But Rebecca's development model required aesthetic uniformity that eliminated any suggestion of self-sufficiency or environmental responsibility. The coalition expanded to include Dr. Robert Chun, a retired chemistry professor who'd been threatened with violations for maintaining a rain garden that supposedly created standing water hazards, despite actually improving drainage for the entire neighborhood. Rebecca's complaint ignored the engineering reports that proved rain gardens prevented basement flooding during severe storms, focusing instead on aesthetic objections to native plants that didn't match her vision of suburban landscaping perfection. She filed complaints with the county health department, claiming my rain garden was breeding disease vectors. Dr. Chen explained with the kind of scientific precision that made Rebecca's environmental illiteracy painfully obvious. The inspection revealed that my property has the lowest mosquito activity in the subdivision because native plants support dragonflies and other natural predators. Her irrigated lawns actually create more breeding habitat than any natural drainage system. The pattern was clear across all cases. Rebecca used false safety and health claims to justify removal of natural features that provided actual environmental benefits, replacing them with artificial landscaping that created the problems she claimed to be solving. Her systematic campaign against any deviation from suburban aesthetic norms was destroying ecosystem services that protected the entire community, while forcing residents to pay for artificial solutions to problems that nature had already solved. Our legal strategy session at Marcus's office revealed the scope of potential prosecution that Rebecca's harassment campaigns had created: federal environmental crimes, state natural resource violations, civil rights violations through selective enforcement of HOA rules, and fraud through false safety claims to government agencies. The woman who thought she was controlling community aesthetics had actually created criminal liability that could result in decades of federal prison time. "The beauty of environmental law," Marcus explained while outlining our prosecution strategy, "is that intent doesn't matter for most violations. If she's demanding destruction of protected habitat, the fact that she doesn't understand environmental regulations isn't a defense. Ignorance of federal law has never been an excuse for environmental crimes, especially when the destruction is irreversible." The community meetings at James Wilson's house became strategy sessions where we coordinated documentation, shared legal resources, and planned public confrontation that would expose Rebecca's systematic abuse to media attention. and regulatory oversight. We established a shared legal fund, distributed responsibilities for evidence gathering, and prepared for the kind of coordinated response that would overwhelm Rebecca's ability to intimidate individual property owners through isolated legal threats. The folder containing Rebecca's violation notices had become evidence in multiple criminal investigations, but more importantly, it had become the foundation for community organizing that would transform isolated harassment into coordinated resistance. The woman who'd tried to control her subdivision through fear and financial pressure was about to face united opposition that understood both the legal weapons available under environmental law and the community organizing necessary to ensure those weapons were used effectively. Rebecca's harassment campaign had awakened something more dangerous than individual resistance. It had created a coalition of people who understood that environmental protection and community self-determination were inseparable, and who had both the legal resources and collective determination to fight back against systematic abuse disguised as HOA governance. Rebecca's desperation escalated to new heights when the first federal investigator arrived at Sunset Ridge Estates, driving an unmarked government sedan that she apparently mistook for another county inspector until Special Agent Catherine Morrison from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service introduced herself and began asking pointed questions about HOA policies regarding native vegetation management. The sight of Rebecca's face cycling through confusion, recognition, and pure terror as she realized federal law enforcement was now involved would have been entertaining if the stakes weren't so serious for the endangered species habitat she'd been trying to destroy. Agent Morrison's investigation triggered panic responses that revealed just how financially precarious Rebecca's empire had become. Within 48 hours of the federal visit, Rebecca was calling emergency HOA board meetings, hiring expensive environmental lawyers from Chicago, and frantically attempting to modify community covenants to eliminate any language that could be interpreted as requiring destruction of native plants. The woman who'd spent months demanding immediate compliance with landscaping standards suddenly discovered the virtues of flexible interpretation and environmental sensitivity when federal criminal charges became a possibility. Her financial house of cards was already wobbling when the federal investigation began, but the threat of criminal prosecution and massive civil penalties pushed her into full desperation mode. The Phase 2 expansion that was supposed to solve her cash flow problems required environmental impact assessments that would inevitably reveal the ecological damage her existing development had caused. Bank loans secured by future development. Profits were now threatened by federal regulations that could prevent any expansion or even require restoration of damaged habitat at costs that would bankrupt the entire project. Rebecca's attempts to pressure me intensified even as federal agents were documenting her previous harassment campaign as evidence of environmental coercion. She hired a private security company to conduct safety patrols around my property, claiming concerns about fire hazards from unmaintained vegetation required professional monitoring to protect community safety. The guards spent their shifts photographing my native plants and measuring grass heights, creating documentation that they apparently believed would support Rebecca's claims about environmental threats. The irony was breathtaking. While federal biologists were confirming that my property contained irreplaceable endangered species habitat, Rebecca was paying security guards to gather evidence for complaints about vegetation that federal law specifically protected from any disturbance. Her hired monitors were unknowingly documenting federal crimes in progress, creating evidence that environmental prosecutors could use to prove systematic harassment of protected wildlife habitat. But Rebecca's most reckless escalation came through her landscape company's emergency vegetation management program, where she began offering free lawn care services to neighbors who complained about my unkempt property affecting their property values. The company would arrive with commercial mowing equipment and chemical spray rigs, creating impressive displays of suburban lawn maintenance that were designed to highlight the contrast between manicured grass and what she continued calling weedy overgrowth. Despite federal protection status, the chemical warfare aspect of her campaign was particularly dangerous and illegal. Her crews began spraying herbicides along property lines, claiming they were treating invasive species that were spreading from my land onto neighboring lawns. The chemicals they used were specifically designed to kill broadleaf plants like wild lupin and purple coneflowers, exactly the species that Carner blue butterflies required for survival. What Rebecca presented as routine lawn maintenance was actually chemical assault on federally protected endangered species habitat. Dr. Patricia Kim's soil testing revealed that Rebecca's herbicide applications were creating contamination plumes that extended onto my property, poisoning native plants that had survived for decades despite suburban development pressure. The chemical analysis showed concentrations of glyphosate and 2,4-D that exceeded safe levels for butterfly larvae, potentially sterilizing soil that supported the genetic diversity Dr. Chen had spent 40 years protecting. This isn't lawn care, Dr. Kim explained while reviewing the contamination data, her voice carrying the controlled anger of a scientist watching irreplaceable research destroyed by suburban ignorance. This is ecological warfare using chemicals that are specifically toxic to the species this habitat protects. She's poisoning endangered species habitat while claiming she's improving community aesthetics. The federal response was swift and severe. Agent Morrison obtained emergency court orders prohibiting any chemical applications within 500 yards of documented Carner blue butterfly habitat, effectively banning herbicide use across most of Sunset Ridge estates. Rebecca's landscape company suddenly found their primary revenue source legally prohibited, with federal monitoring to ensure compliance and criminal penalties for any violations. Rebecca's reaction to the federal intervention revealed the depth of her financial desperation and complete lack of understanding about environmental law. She attempted to organize community resistance to federal overreach, hosting meetings where she encouraged residents to file complaints with congressional representatives about government interference in local property management. Her presentation emphasized threats to property values and individual rights, carefully avoiding any mention of endangered species protection or the criminal penalties she was facing. The federal government is trying to control how we maintain our own properties, she announced to a poorly attended community meeting where most residents seemed more concerned about potential legal liability than supporting her resistance campaign. They want to turn our beautiful subdivision into some kind of government nature preserve where we can't even cut our grass without permission from Washington bureaucrats. But Rebecca's attempt to frame environmental protection as government overreach backfired when residents realized that her violations could trigger federal asset forfeiture that would affect their property values far more than butterfly habitat protection. Federal environmental crimes carried penalties that included seizure of properties used in habitat destruction, potentially making their homes collateral in criminal prosecutions that Rebecca's harassment campaign had triggered. The community meeting devolved into chaos when Dr. Chun stood up and explained the actual legal situation in terms that made Rebecca's propaganda seem not just wrong, but dangerously misleading. Mrs. Martinez isn't fighting government overreach, he said with the quiet authority of someone who understood federal law better than the woman who'd been violating it. She's committed environmental crimes that could result in federal seizure of the entire subdivision. We're not protecting our property rights by supporting her. We're risking our homes to protect her criminal activity. Rebecca's financial desperation reached new levels when her insurance company canceled liability coverage after learning about federal environmental crime investigations. The policy exclusions for criminal activity meant that any damages from habitat destruction would be her personal responsibility, potentially including restoration costs that environmental lawyers estimated at over $10 million for replacing 40 Years of prairie ecosystem development. Her marriage began showing stress as David Martinez realized that his landscaping company was implicated in federal environmental crimes through the herbicide applications they'd conducted under Rebecca's direction. The couple's joint business empire was now potential evidence in criminal prosecution, with asset forfeiture possibilities that could eliminate their wealth and result in federal prison sentences for both of them. The breaking point came when Rebecca attempted to bribe me directly, offering $500,000 cash for a signed statement that I'd been maintaining invasive weeds rather than native plants, thereby retroactively justifying her harassment campaign and potentially reducing her criminal liability. The offer was made during a parking lot encounter at the grocery store, with Rebecca's voice pitched high with desperation as she explained that federal investigators were misunderstanding the environmental situation. "This is all a big mistake," she said, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the stress lines that federal investigation had carved around her eyes. "Those plants really are invasive species, and we can prove it if you'll just sign a statement confirming that you've been having problems with them spreading onto other properties. $500,000 cash, no questions asked, problem solved. For everyone." The bribery attempt was recorded on my phone and immediately forwarded to Agent Morrison, adding federal obstruction of justice charges to Rebecca's growing list of criminal violations. Attempting to suborn perjury in a federal environmental crime investigation was a separate felony that carried mandatory minimum sentences, regardless of whether the underlying environmental charges resulted in conviction. Rebecca's world was collapsing. With mathematical precision, federal criminal investigation, state environmental crime charges, civil liability for habitat destruction, insurance cancellation, bank loan recalls, marriage dissolution, and now obstruction of justice charges that eliminated any possibility of plea bargaining. The woman who'd thought she could intimidate a disabled veteran into destroying endangered species habitat was discovering that environmental law provided weapons that could dismantle her entire life with surgical efficiency. Her final desperate gambit involved hiring a team of environmental consultants to conduct independent assessment of my property's ecological value, hoping to find scientific evidence that would contradict federal findings about endangered species habitat. The consultants lasted exactly 1 day before concluding that Dr. Chun's prairie restoration was among the most significant conservation achievements in Illinois history, with biodiversity values that exceeded anything they'd encountered in decades of professional work. The consultant's report was so glowing in its praise for the habitat quality that Rebecca refused to pay their fees, triggering yet another lawsuit that added to her mounting legal expenses while providing additional evidence of her systematic attempt to destroy irreplaceable ecological resources. The woman who'd built her wealth by eliminating natural ecosystems was being destroyed by her inability to understand that some things were more valuable than money and more protected than HOA covenants. The Sunset Ridge Community Center had never witnessed anything like the scene that unfolded on that humid Thursday evening in late August, when nearly 200 residents packed into a space designed for half that number. The air conditioning system struggled against the combination of human body heat and the tension that crackled through the room like electricity before a thunderstorm. News crews from 3 local television stations had set up cameras in the back corner, their equipment creating pools of harsh white light that made the proceeding feel more like a criminal trial than a homeowners association meeting. Rebecca's faction occupied the front rows, a notably smaller group than her previous community gatherings, consisting mainly of her husband David, 2 landscape company employees who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, and a handful of residents who seemed more concerned about their own potential legal liability than supporting her environmental crimes. Her expensive Chicago environmental lawyer sat at a table positioned strategically near the exit, briefcase packed with documents that everyone in the room knew wouldn't save his client from the federal charges that were coming. My coalition filled the rest of the space with the kind of diverse community representation that Rebecca's exclusive development had never seen before. James Wilson and his wife occupied seats in the third row, surrounded by neighbors who'd finally found the courage to speak publicly about Rebecca's systematic harassment. Maria Santos had brought her teenage daughter, turning the meeting into a civics lesson about standing up to bullies who hide behind legal authority. Dr. Patricia Kim sat with university colleagues who'd driven down from Champaign, specifically to witness environmental justice in action. Most significantly, Agent Morrison occupied a seat in the middle section, her federal credentials clearly visible and her presence serving as a reminder that this wasn't just a community dispute anymore. It was evidence gathering for criminal prosecution that would determine whether Rebecca Martinez spent the next decade in federal prison. The special agent's notepad remained open throughout the meeting, documenting every word that Rebecca said for potential use in environmental crime trials that could destroy not just her personal freedom, but her entire business empire. Rebecca called the meeting to order with hands that trembled slightly as she shuffled presentation materials that everyone knew were meaningless given the federal investigation that had transformed her HOA authority into potential evidence of criminal conspiracy. Her voice pitched higher than usual as she attempted to maintain the authoritative demeanor that had intimidated residents for years. But the desperation underneath was obvious to anyone who understood that environmental crimes carried mandatory minimum sentences that excluded plea bargaining options. Tonight we'll be addressing the ongoing situation with certain properties that have created regulatory complications for our community, she began, her corporate speak unable to disguise the fact that she was discussing federal crimes that could result in asset forfeiture for the entire subdivision. We need to find solutions that protect both individual property rights and community standards while working within the regulatory framework that government agencies have imposed on our neighborhood. The euphemistic language was painful to listen to, like watching someone describe arson as unauthorized heating solutions, or calling theft involuntary property redistribution. Rebecca's attempt to frame environmental crime prosecution as regulatory overreach demonstrated either complete legal ignorance or calculated deception designed to manipulate residents who didn't understand the severity of federal environmental law violations. But her presentation never gained momentum because I stood up during her opening remarks, connecting my laptop to the projection system and displaying federal endangered species Act statutes on the wall where everyone could see the criminal penalties that Rebecca's harassment campaign had triggered. The legal text was dense and technical, but the penalty sections were crystal clear. Up to $50,000 per violation, asset forfeiture for properties used in environmental crimes, and federal prison sentences that started at 5 years and increased based on ecological damage severity. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying the authority that military training provided for addressing hostile audiences, "Mrs. Martinez isn't dealing with regulatory complications. She's under federal criminal investigation for environmental crimes that could result in seizure of this entire subdivision. Every demand she's made for destruction of native plants on my property constitutes conspiracy to commit federal environmental crimes." The room erupted in shocked murmurs as residents realized for the first time that Rebecca's harassment campaign had created criminal liability that extended far beyond her personal legal problems. Federal asset forfeiture laws allowed government seizure of any property used in environmental crimes, potentially making their homes collateral in criminal prosecutions that Rebecca's systematic habitat destruction had triggered. Marcus Rodriguez took the microphone next, his environmental law expertise providing detailed explanation of how Rebecca's violations had escalated from simple HOA overreach to federal criminal conspiracy. His presentation included timeline documentation showing Rebecca's systematic escalation, from fines to false government complaints to chemical warfare against endangered species habitat, each step creating additional criminal liability under federal environmental statutes. Environmental coercion is a federal crime, Marcus explained, displaying Rebecca's violation notices alongside relevant criminal statutes. Mrs. Martinez has demanded that Mr. Thompson commit federal environmental crimes, then threatened financial penalties when he refused. That's environmental extortion under federal law, and it carries mandatory minimum sentences regardless of whether actual habitat destruction occurred. But the most devastating moment came when Dr. Patricia Kim presented her scientific analysis of Rebecca's herbicide applications, explaining in terms that any layperson could understand how chemical attacks on endangered species habitat constituted some of the most serious environmental crimes under federal law. Her slides showed before and after photographs of native plants that had been poisoned by Rebecca's emergency vegetation management program, with soil contamination data that proved systematic chemical warfare against federally protected butterfly habitat. What Mrs. Martinez has described as routine lawn maintenance is actually chemical assault on irreplaceable endangered species habitat. Dr. Kim said, her academic credentials lending scientific authority that made Rebecca's aesthetic justification seem criminally absurd. The herbicides her company applied are specifically toxic to Carter blue butterfly larvae, potentially sterilizing soil that supports genetic diversity that took millennia to develop and could never be recovered once destroyed. The community response was swift and unanimous. James Wilson stood up to describe how Rebecca's harassment had cost him thousands in legal fees while threatening century-old oak trees that provided actual environmental benefits. Maria Santos explained how vegetable garden violations had forced her family to choose between feeding her children and paying HOA fines for growing food instead of decorative flowers that served no practical purpose. But Dr. Chen delivered the knockout punch when he presented documentation of Rebecca's systematic chemical contamination that had affected groundwater quality across the entire subdivision. His analysis showed that her landscape company's herbicide applications had created pollution plumes that violated both state and federal water quality regulations, potentially triggering additional environmental crime charges that could multiply her criminal liability exponentially. Mrs. Martinez isn't protecting our property values, Dr. Chun said with the quiet authority of someone who understood environmental science better than the woman who'd been violating it. She's poisoned our groundwater while destroying habitat that provides natural pest control and flood prevention. We're not supporting community standards by defending her. We're protecting criminal activity that threatens our health and safety. Rebecca's desperate attempt to respond collapsed into incoherent rambling about property rights and government overreach, but her words were drowned out by residents who'd finally understood that environmental protection and community safety were inseparable. The woman who'd built her authority on fear and financial intimidation was facing a room full of people who understood that her crimes threatened their homes, their health, and their children's future. Agent Morrison's presence transformed what could have been community theater into evidence gathering for federal prosecution. Every word Rebecca spoke was potentially admissible in criminal trials. Every threat she made was additional evidence of environmental coercion. Every attempt to justify habitat destruction was confession of federal crimes that carried penalties more severe than anything her HOA authority could impose. The formal vote was swift and devastating. Removal of Rebecca Martinez as HOA president by unanimous decision. Dissolution of exclusive contracts with Martinez Landscaping. And community resolution supporting federal prosecution of environmental crimes that had threatened both endangered species habitat and residential property values. The woman who'd tried to control her subdivision through systematic environmental destruction was officially repudiated by the community she'd claimed to represent. But Rebecca's meltdown was spectacular in its complete revelation of criminal intent. Faced with unanimous community rejection and federal criminal charges, she screamed about conspiracies and unfair treatment while accidentally confessing to document fraud, bribery attempts, and systematic harassment that federal prosecutors could use to build cases for multiple felony convictions. "Those plants are just weeds," she shrieked as sheriff's deputies moved to restore order, her voice carrying across a room where federal agents were recording every word for potential use in criminal trials. "I had every right to demand proper landscaping, and if that means removing so-called protected species, then the law is wrong and I was right to fight it." The confession was so complete and incriminating that Agent Morrison closed her notepad with the satisfied expression of someone who just witnessed a suspect eliminate any possibility of successful legal defense. Rebecca had publicly admitted to environmental crimes while promising continued violations, creating evidence that would ensure federal conviction, regardless of whatever legal strategy her expensive lawyers might attempt. As Rebecca was escorted from the building, still screaming threats and promises of revenge, the community that she'd terrorized for years finally understood that environmental law provided weapons powerful enough to destroy anyone who thought suburban aesthetics were more important than ecological preservation. The woman who'd tried to eliminate nature from her artificial paradise had been eliminated by laws that recognized some things as more valuable than property values and more permanent than HOA covenants 3 weeks after the community meeting. That ended Rebecca Martinez's reign of environmental terror. Federal agents arrested her at 6:30 a.m. as she attempted to flee to her vacation home in Florida with suitcases full of cash and financial records that investigators had been seeking for months. The sight of Rebecca in handcuffs on the morning news, her perfectly styled hair disheveled and her designer outfit wrinkled from a night in county jail, felt like the final chapter of a story that had consumed my life for 8 months, but would protect this ecosystem for generations. The federal charges were comprehensive and devastating: conspiracy to destroy endangered species habitat, environmental coercion, obstruction of justice, document fraud, bribery, money laundering through HOA funds, and violation of the Clean Water Act through systematic chemical contamination. Agent Morrison explained that the investigation had revealed financial crimes extending far beyond environmental violations, including tax evasion, insurance fraud, and embezzlement of homeowner association funds that had been used to finance her harassment campaigns against residents who challenged her authority. Rebecca's business empire collapsed with mathematical precision once federal asset forfeiture procedures began. The Martinez Landscaping Company lost all municipal contracts when city councils learned about criminal environmental violations, while Sunset Ridge Estates Development Corporation faced bankruptcy proceedings that would liquidate assets to pay restitution for ecological damage. The woman who'd built her wealth by destroying natural ecosystems was being dismantled by the same systematic approach she'd used to terrorize property owners who refused to conform to her aesthetic vision. But the legal resolution extended far beyond Rebecca's personal destruction. The federal court ordered environmental restoration that would transform Sunset Ridge Estates from a sterile suburban monoculture into a model community that demonstrated how residential development could coexist with native ecosystem protection. The restoration requirements included removing non-native landscaping, eliminating chemical lawn treatments, and establishing native plant corridors that would connect isolated habitat patches across the entire subdivision. The financial penalties were staggering in their scope and precedent-setting impact. Rebecca faced $2.3 million in federal fines for endangered species violations, plus restoration costs that environmental engineers estimated at over $8 million for recreating 40 years of prairie ecosystem development. The restitution requirements included funding for university research programs that would monitor habitat recovery for decades, ensuring that the ecological damage her development had caused would be reversed through scientifically managed restoration. Projects. My personal vindication came through a federal court settlement that established permanent conservation protections while providing compensation for the harassment and legal expenses that Rebecca's criminal campaign had imposed. The settlement included attorney fees, damages for emotional distress caused by systematic environmental coercion, and funding for habitat enhancement projects that would expand the prairie restoration beyond its original boundaries. More importantly, the court ordered establishment of conservation easements that would prevent any future development pressure on the restored ecosystem. The community transformation exceeded anything imagined when this battle began. James Wilson's century-old oak trees were incorporated into a community forest preserve that provided natural stormwater management for the entire subdivision. Maria Santos's vegetable garden became the centerpiece of a community food security program that replaced ornamental landscaping with productive native plants that supported both human nutrition and wildlife habitat. Dr. Chun's rain garden served as the model for subdivision-wide bioswales that eliminated chemical runoff while providing natural flood control. Individual outcomes for Rebecca's victims demonstrated the power of environmental law to provide both justice and restoration. James received $150,000 in damages for legal fees and emotional distress, plus permanent protection for his oak grove through federal conservation easements that increased his property value while ensuring the trees could never be threatened by future development pressure. Maria's family was awarded $75,000 for harassment damages and community recognition for sustainable living practices that other residents began adopting once Rebecca's aesthetic tyranny ended. The environmental restoration program attracted national attention from conservation organizations that use Sunset Ridge Estates as a model for reversing suburban ecological damage through legal enforcement of habitat protection requirements. University research programs established permanent monitoring stations that tracked ecosystem recovery while providing educational opportunities for students studying ecological restoration and environmental law enforcement. The broader systemic impact spread across Illinois and neighboring states as environmental prosecutors used Rebecca's case as precedent for challenging other development projects that threatened protected ecosystems. Her conviction established legal precedents that made environmental coercion a prosecutable federal crime, providing tools that conservation organizations could use to protect habitat from systematic harassment by developers who assumed that suburban residents wouldn't understand or enforce environmental law. Real estate industry reforms followed directly from Rebecca's prosecution, with new disclosure requirements for HOA environmental policies and mandatory training for community association managers about federal habitat protection laws. The industry recognized that environmental crimes carried penalties that could destroy entire development projects, making ecological compliance a financial necessity rather than an optional consideration for profit maximization. But the most satisfying outcome was watching the prairie restoration expand beyond my original property as other residents discovered the peace and practical benefits that native landscaping provided. Chemical-free yards reduced health problems for children and pets, while native plants eliminated irrigation costs and provided natural pest control that made artificial lawn treatments unnecessary. Property values increased as environmentally conscious buyers sought homes in communities that demonstrated ecological responsibility rather than sterile suburban conformity. The Habitat Protection Program became self-sustaining as federal monitoring grants provided ongoing funding for ecosystem management, while university partnerships ensured that conservation practices would continue, improving based on scientific research rather than aesthetic preferences. The Karner blue butterfly population tripled within 2 years as habitat corridors connected previously isolated prairie patches, demonstrating that suburban development could actually enhance biodiversity when guided by ecological principles. Rather than profit maximization, financial justice extended to the entire community, as Rebecca's asset forfeiture provided funding for infrastructure improvements that she'd neglected while spending HOA dues on harassment campaigns and personal legal expenses. New community facilities included environmental education centers, native plant nurseries, and demonstration gardens that showed other subdivisions how ecological restoration could reduce maintenance costs while improving quality of life for residents. My personal transformation was equally profound, as defending the prairie had provided purpose and community connection that VA therapy programs had never achieved. The daily routine of habitat monitoring and ecosystem management gave structure to retirement from military service while demonstrating that combat skills could be redirected toward environmental protection rather than destruction. The hypervigilance that made civilian life challenging became valuable for observing wildlife behavior and detecting environmental threats that required immediate response. The conservation legacy established through Rebecca's prosecution extended far beyond legal precedents to create educational resources that would prevent future environmental crimes through public awareness rather than after-the-fact prosecution. School programs brought students to the restored prairie, where they learned about ecosystem relationships and environmental law, creating generations of citizens who would recognize and resist attempts to destroy protected habitat for suburban aesthetic preferences. Legislative impact included new state laws strengthening penalties for environmental coercion and requiring disclosure of ecological impacts before HOA rule enforcement. Rebecca's case demonstrated that environmental crimes often began with systematic harassment of individual property owners, making early intervention crucial for preventing irreversible habitat destruction that federal law was designed to protect. Research partnerships established through court-ordered restoration created permanent institutional relationships between the community and environmental science programs that would ensure long-term habitat protection through adaptive management. Based on ongoing ecological monitoring, the prairie that Rebecca had tried to destroy became a living laboratory that advanced understanding of how urban ecosystems could support biodiversity while providing practical benefits for human communities. But perhaps the most important outcome was demonstrating that environmental law provided weapons powerful enough to defeat systematic abuse disguised as community governance, creating precedents that would protect other veterans and vulnerable property owners from harassment campaigns designed to force destruction of natural resources that served both ecological and therapeutic purposes. Rebecca's prosecution proved that some battles choose their own champions, and that environmental justice could provide both personal vindication and systemic change that would protect irreplaceable ecosystems for generations who would never know how close they came to losing something that could never be replaced once destroyed. The evening air still carries the scent of native plants that Rebecca wanted me to eliminate, but now those plants are federally protected and expanding across a subdivision that has become a model for ecological restoration rather than environmental destruction. Where Rebecca once saw obstacles to suburban perfection, the community now sees valuable habitat that provides both practical benefits and spiritual renewal for people who understand that some things are more important than artificial aesthetic standards imposed by someone who confused control with leadership and profit with progress. The ripple effects from Rebecca's prosecution transformed environmental law enforcement across the entire Midwest, creating legal precedents that conservation attorneys are still using 3 years later to protect threatened ecosystems from development pressure disguised as community improvement projects. The Federal Environmental Crimes Unit established a new category of violations, specifically addressing aesthetic coercion, the systematic use of homeowner association authority to force destruction of protected habitat through financial intimidation and false safety claims. Environmental prosecutors from 7 states attended conferences where Agent Morrison presented Rebecca's case as a template for identifying and prosecuting environmental crimes that traditional law enforcement might dismiss as civil HOA disputes. The training materials developed from our documentation became standard curriculum for federal environmental crime investigators, teaching them to recognize patterns of harassment that escalate from aesthetic complaints to systematic habitat destruction through abuse of local regulatory authority. The legal framework we'd established attracted attention from indigenous rights advocates who recognized similarities between Rebecca's tactics and historical attempts to eliminate native ecosystems through claims about improvement and proper land use. Tribal environmental programs began using endangered species protections to resist mining and development projects on traditional lands, citing our case as precedent for federal environmental law superseding local development authority, regardless of economic or political pressure. International environmental organizations incorporated our community organizing strategies into training programs for habitat protection advocates in countries where development pressure threatened irreplaceable ecosystems. The combination of scientific documentation, legal preparation, and community coalition building became a model for defending protected areas against systematic encroachment by developers who assumed that environmental law was too complex for local communities to understand and enforce effectively. Universities across the region established research partnerships with Sunset Ridge Estates, creating the first subdivision-based ecological restoration program that demonstrated how residential development could actually enhance biodiversity through scientifically managed native landscaping. The ongoing studies attracted federal research grants that funded graduate student projects while providing long-term monitoring data that informed conservation policy at state and national levels. The most unexpected outcome was discovering how many other veterans were facing similar harassment over property use that provided therapeutic benefits for combat-related disabilities. My story reached veteran support networks through social media and military publications, triggering hundreds of contacts from former service members who were being pressured to eliminate gardens, workshops, or other healing spaces that didn't conform to suburban aesthetic standards but were crucial for managing PTSD, chronic pain, and adjustment disorders. Veterans Administration officials recognized that environmental harassment represented a new category of disability discrimination that could undermine therapeutic progress for veterans whose recovery depended on specific landscape features or land use practices. The VA established legal support programs specifically for veterans facing HOA conflicts over property use related to disability accommodation, providing both legal representation and expert testimony about therapeutic landscape requirements. For combat trauma recovery, the documentation techniques we developed for fighting Rebecca's harassment became training materials for veteran advocacy organizations, teaching disabled former service members how to create evidence files that would support both environmental protection claims and disability rights litigation. A systematic approach to recording violations, gathering expert testimony, and building community support proved equally effective for protecting therapeutic landscapes and challenging discriminatory enforcement of community regulations. Legal aid organizations expanded their environmental justice programs to include habitat protection, advocacy for low-income property owners who couldn't afford private attorneys but owned land with significant ecological value. Rebecca's case demonstrated that federal environmental law provided powerful tools for challenging systematic harassment by wealthy developers, but only if victims understood how to access legal resources and build community support for environmental protection claims. The policy implications extended to federal disability rights enforcement, where agencies recognize that Veterans Administration recommendations for therapeutic landscape management could constitute reasonable accommodation requirements that superseded HOA aesthetic regulations. Environmental features that supported veteran health and wellness became protected under both disability law and environmental statute, creating dual legal protections that made harassment campaigns like Rebecca's extremely risky for community. Associations. Corporate environmental compliance programs incorporated lessons from Rebecca's prosecution into risk management protocols that emphasized the financial dangers of environmental crime liability for real estate development companies. Insurance carriers began requiring environmental compliance audits before providing coverage for HOA operations, recognizing that systematic habitat destruction could trigger federal asset forfeiture that would eliminate their ability to recover. Claims payments. The community organizing model we developed attracted attention from environmental justice advocates working in low-income communities, where development pressure threatened both ecological resources and community health. Our combination of scientific documentation, legal preparation, and coalition building provided a framework for challenging environmental racism disguised as economic development, particularly in communities where residents lacked resources for prolonged legal battles against well-funded developers. Educational institutions began incorporating environmental crime case studies into business school curricula, using Rebecca's prosecution to teach future corporate leaders about the financial risks of environmental law violations and the importance of ecological compliance in real estate development. The case studies emphasized how environmental crimes could destroy profitable development projects through criminal prosecution, civil liability, and asset forfeiture that exceeded potential profits from habitat destruction. The research applications expanded beyond habitat restoration to include studies of community resilience and environmental justice that used Sunset Ridge Estates as a model for successful resistance to systematic environmental harassment. Social science researchers documented how our coalition building strategies could be adapted to other contexts where powerful interests used legal authority to pressure vulnerable populations into accepting environmental degradation. Federal agencies modified enforcement protocols to prioritize environmental coercion cases that involved systematic harassment of individual property owners, recognizing that early intervention could prevent habitat destruction that would be impossible to reverse. Through post-violation prosecution, the enforcement changes meant that developers who relied on intimidation tactics to force environmental compliance would face federal investigation before irreversible ecological damage occurred. The technological innovations we developed for documenting harassment became standard tools for environmental protection advocacy, with smartphone apps that helped property owners create legally admissible evidence files while connecting them with attorneys and scientific experts who specialized in habitat protection law. The documentation systems made environmental law enforcement accessible to people who lacked legal training but needed protection from systematic pressure to destroy ecologically valuable landscapes. Professional training programs for community association managers now include mandatory education about federal environmental law and the criminal penalties for demanding habitat destruction through HOA enforcement. The training emphasizes that aesthetic preferences cannot override environmental protection requirements, and that managers who participate in environmental coercion face personal criminal liability that professional insurance policies don't cover. The financial sector implemented new due diligence requirements for development loans that include environmental crime risk assessments and habitat protection compliance reviews before approving financing for residential construction projects. Rebecca's asset forfeiture demonstrated that environmental violations could eliminate collateral value faster than market fluctuations, making ecological compliance a credit requirement rather than an optional consideration for development financing. Regional conservation organizations established rapid response networks that could mobilize legal and scientific support for property owners facing environmental harassment, using our case as a model for coordinated community organizing that combined legal preparation with media advocacy. The networks reduced the isolation that made individual property owners vulnerable to systematic intimidation, while creating educational resources that helped communities recognize and resist environmental crimes. The therapeutic landscape movement gained momentum as medical professionals recognized the connection between environmental quality and veteran health outcomes, leading to Veterans Administration programs that explicitly supported habitat restoration as therapeutic intervention. For combat-related disabilities, medical testimony about landscape therapy became standard. Evidence in disability accommodation cases involving HOA conflicts over property use, but perhaps the most important, long-term impact was demonstrating that environmental law could serve as a tool for community empowerment rather than just regulatory enforcement, providing legal weapons that ordinary citizens could use to resist systematic abuse by powerful interests who assumed that environmental protection was too complex for local communities to understand and implement effectively. Rebecca's prosecution proved that environmental justice was achievable when people understood both the legal protections available under federal statute and the community organizing necessary to ensure those protections were enforced consistently and effectively. The precedents we established continue protecting endangered species habitat from development pressure while providing legal tools that other communities can use to resist environmental crime, disguised as aesthetic improvement, ensuring that Rebecca's attempt to destroy irreplaceable ecosystem became instead the foundation for environmental protection that will preserve critical habitat for generations of both wildlife and humans who understand that some things are more valuable than suburban conformity and more permanent than property values. The story was already complete with part 10, but here's a powerful conclusion to wrap everything up. 5 years later, I stand on my front porch watching children from the local elementary school learn to identify native butterflies in what was once Rebecca's sterile lawn empire. The Karner blue population has expanded across 12 counties, and the habitat corridors we created have become a model for suburban conservation nationwide. What started as one woman's petty harassment of a disabled veteran became the catalyst for protecting over 50,000 acres of prairie remnants across the Midwest. Rebecca served 4 years in federal prison and was released to a halfway house where she works minimum wage, cleaning the same government offices where she once filed false environmental complaints. Her former mansion was converted into an environmental education center where thousands of visitors learn about the economic and ecological value of native ecosystems. The irony is perfect. The woman who tried to eliminate nature now has her legacy forever tied to its protection. Last month, I received a letter from a Marine veteran in Colorado whose HOA was pressuring him to remove native plants that helped with his PTSD. I sent him our legal playbook, scientific documentation, and contact information for environmental attorneys who now specialize in habitat protection cases. The fight continues, but now we have weapons and a roadmap for victory. The prairie that Rebecca called weeds now hosts university research programs, federal butterfly monitoring stations, and community gardens that feed 12 families year-round. What she saw as obstacles to suburban perfection became foundations for genuine community prosperity that doesn't depend on destroying the natural world that sustains us. Remember, environmental law is more powerful than most people realize. And sometimes the best revenge is conservation that outlasts your enemies by centuries. If you enjoyed this story about turning environmental harassment into habitat protection, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Share your own HOA horror stories in the comments. I read every single one and respond when I can. Together, we're building a community that knows how to fight back against suburban tyranny while protecting the natural world for future generations.